Hi everyone. I'll go ahead and actually just get started. I know it's a busy time of the year for everyone, so for the sake of time, I'll get started and then people can kind of trickle in as they can. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. For those of you that haven't joined one of our events before, my name is Kayla Zhu and I'm this year's chair of the Undergraduate Committee on Global Thought, and I co-lead this organization with my vice chairs Olivia Seeler and Avalon Fenster. And again, those of you that aren't familiar with our work, the Undergraduate Committee on Global Thought is the undergraduate branch of the Columbia Committee on Global Thought, and we essentially aim to connect the undergraduate community here at Columbia with the rich resources available to engage in international issues here at Columbia. So before I move on to tonight's event, I do want to quickly plug really quick that next Friday, April 8th from 10 to 12 p.m., we'll be hosting our first conference, and the title is The Urgency of Global Ethics, Notions of Justice in an Interconnected World. And it should be a really great event. We'll have a keynote speaker as well as student-led workshops on topics like migration, transitional justice, and corporate social responsibility, and analyzing these issues essentially through the perspective of ethics. So if that's of interest to you, I'll be sure to leave the registration link in the chat box, and it would be really great if we could see some of you guys next week. But with that being said, I'll turn to tonight's conversation. So tonight's event is Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in International Affairs. As a first generation Asian American, this topic is extremely important to me. And just as a young woman of color just starting their career, it's very apparent that, international affairs, people think by nature is a very diverse space, and it is, but at the same time, that doesn't mean it's an accessible space still for those from underrepresented communities. So this is an extremely important conversation, and we're really grateful for the CGT and the UCGT for giving us the space to talk about this tonight. So with that being said, I'll quickly introduce our panelists. So first, we have Asha Sheikh, who's currently a 2L at Yale Law School, as well as a graduate of Rutgers University, where she studied political science and Middle Eastern studies. Asha began her career as a gender equity advocate at the United Nations when she was only 15 years old. And for the last 2 years, she was the sole American representative on the UN Women's Generation Equality Youth Task Force. And she also is a Truman Scholar, as well as a recipient of the US State Department's Critical Language Scholarship. And then we also are joined by Tiffany Batiste, who is actually a alumni of the Global Thought Masters here at Columbia. She's of the class of 2019. She also has a master's in intelligence studies from the American Military University, as well as a bachelor's in Asian studies from Furman University. Tiffany currently serves as a foreign area officer at the US military, providing the Army with political, cultural, sociological, and the regional awareness essentially necessary to navigate international military engagement. She's also a specialist in China and will be beginning a post in Beijing next year. And then finally, we were supposed to be joined by Hayat, who is an Egyptian filmmaker who works to use film as a medium for cultural understanding, but unfortunately she's sick, but I really recommend you check out her work if you're interested. And we're grateful to all our panelists for taking their time out of their evenings to have this conversation with us. And finally, I'll introduce our moderator, Dr. Vishaka Desai, and she's currently our chair of the Columbia Committee on Global Thought, as well as a senior advisor for global affairs to the president of Columbia University, as well as a senior research scholar in global studies at the School of International and Public Affairs. Prior to her time at Columbia, Dr. Desai was the first woman and first Asian American woman to lead the Asia Society, an international organization dedicated to strengthening partnerships among Asians and Americans in a global context. And during her time as president, she was the only person of color to lead an international NGO with a global footprint. So prior to her time at the Asia Society, Dr. Desai was at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, as well as a professor teaching at Columbia, Boston University, just to name a few. And she works at the intersection of international affairs and arts. So we're extremely grateful for all of our panelists and our moderator. And with that being said, I'll turn it to Dr. Desai to lead tonight's conversation.
Okay, terrific. Are we all set? Great. So first of all, Kayla, thank you for thinking of this very, very important conversation. I think the reason why it's important is not only because as a subject, it needs to be discussed, but it's also because it's acknowledged by many people that this is an urgent issue. So I want to just start with giving you a few statistics. The truth is that, for example, 40% of American population is actually a population that is non-European in origin, people of color. But 13%, only 13% of the State Department's senior executive positions are filled by people of color. And of that 13%, women are even smaller percentage. At the same time, it's also useful to remember that actually State Department has been losing people of color in senior positions, particularly women of color, at a higher rate in the last 10 years. Fortune 500 in the corporate world. As we know, white males are 35% of the American population. But up until 10 years ago, they were 92% of the CEOs. That number has gone down to now some 86%. However, if you look at CEOs of color, it is 1% African American, 2.4% East or South Asian American, 3.4% Latinx. And so if you look at when the white males have lost their position from 92% to 86%, most of those positions have gone to white women. So one of the points we have to recognize is that diversity, equity, and inclusion, which has a double whammy for women of color, both the bamboo ceiling, as sometimes people have said, for Asian American women, and the glass ceiling for the gender side. At the same time, we know that actually these things are changing, but slowly, not fast. Tiffany and I were just talking that actually in the group that she's in, there may be 5 women of color out of 2,000 women of people who are in this particular arena in the Department of Defense. And up until recently, there was only 1 woman of color. So the issue is real. And at the same time, we have 2 exceptional panelists who actually are the living example of the best and the brightest who actually are making a difference. So I'm just thrilled to have both Tiffany and Asha with us to actually engage them in a conversation about what it means to break new ground. What does it mean to start afresh and bring other people along? So let's get going, and we will switch to, let's see if we can get Tiffany and Asha. Wonderful. Let me see. Good. So let's get started. I think that, Asha, very nice to meet you. Tiffany, I know because she was actually a student of mine. So we are thrilled to have her, and she's going big places, and that's also a moment of big pride for us. And Asha, you've broken many grounds in many positions. It's hard for me to recognize that as a young person, you started at the age of 15. That's a little scary, but be that as it may, I'm proud of you too. I want to start with a very simple kind of conversation, and that is a question for both of you. How did you actually get involved in this international arena? It was not a given. And Tiffany, I'll start with you. It's not a given that actually, as a person of color, partly because, let's face it, pale, male, and Yale was actually the motto, as it were, of the State Department for a long time. And it has been changing a little bit too. So how did you both get started into this arena that, as Kayla was saying, it seems like it should be much more diverse just because it's international. But guess what? It is not so always. So tell us, how did you get going? Tiffany first and Asha, then you.
Yeah, so I am in the Army. I just hit 17 years. And so my first 10 years in the Army, I was doing something else, but it gave me the opportunity to travel. And when I say travel, I mean I hit all the continents, whether it be because the military sent me there or I just decided I was going to pick up and go. So that really opened my eyes, but it opened my eyes also to the perceptions of America and the ability for us as a country to tell other countries what it is that we're about and what we want to do and how we want to help and when we want to be helpful. And so about halfway through my career, I found out about this program and I applied for it. And, you know, I I wanted to go back to Germany because I love being in Germany and it is still the army. And so they said, that's cute. We're going to send you where we want to send you. So I am a China focused foreign area officer, but I have enjoyed every minute of it because I've lived in the Philippines. I've personally gone and advocated America's interests and our ability to assist other countries in almost every country of Southeast Asia. And now I'm headed to China next. And even what I'm doing right now, I get to work with international officers as they come into the Washington, D.C. area. And so it's kind of been a natural evolution of my career. But I think that it is not an evolution that most people of color take. I think usually they'll either become disaffected with just being a minority and the struggles that come with that and get out of the military, or they'll seek ways to blend in more. And what I'm doing is kind of highlighting myself more and more every day.
No, I mean, that's why I was giving the statistic that actually more people of color have left senior positions in the State Department. And that says something about exactly what you're saying. Asha, for you?
Yeah, so for me, as Kayla mentioned, my work started when I was in high school with the Working Group on Girls at the United Nations. And so the Working Group on Girls is a coalition of 75 plus NGOs and civil society organizations specifically focused on girls' rights at the UN and globally. And I actually got involved with them. So I was born and raised here in New Jersey right after my parents immigrated here, like literally a month after. My mom was 8 months pregnant when they immigrated, which is wild.
From? Where did your parents come from?
Oh, sorry, they immigrated from India.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I grew up here, but there was one year, my like 8th or 9th grade year, that we went back to India for a year, just so that we could, be a bit closer to family and whatnot. And so it was actually right after coming back from India that I first got involved with the work at the UN. And I think that that was kind of a very formative experience for me. And a big part of what I wrote and shared in bringing to the Girl Advocate position was about kind of the stark contrast between girls' rights abroad and here, but also what being abroad like highlighted to me about the persistent inequalities here. And so that was really how I first got into the space, was pulling from that experience.
Yeah. So both of you have mentioned something that's very interesting, and that is that on the one hand, it's the American side. And Tiffany, you mentioned that you're representing that in the world. And at the same time, Asha, you mentioned that by looking at it from outside in, you also thought about the inequalities in America. And so, how did you both navigate that sort of seems like a contradiction? On the one hand, especially as you get to be a more senior person, like both of you have done, you have to, in a way, position what is the American position, Tiffany, especially for you. And yet, you're very aware of the flaws in the American system. And you go somewhere else and you recognize that for them, you're an American more than you're a minority from America. So, how do you deal with that contradiction, which sometimes I know in my experience, people also thought, but you're not really American, are you? So, that's for those of us who are immigrants, it's a little less of an issue for African Americans. But for those of us who are immigrants, that is another issue that comes up. So, how do you navigate that? Asha?
Yeah, I think yeah, the not American piece always gets me, especially when I was doing my critical language scholarship in Amman, Jordan, for one summer in college. Every single Uber driver, taxi driver, they would ask, "Where are you from?" I'd say America. They'd say, "But where are you really from?" The whole thing.
The usual, right? Where
yes,
you really
exactly.
from? That's the common question, right?
Right. Definitely prefer it from them versus like white Americans, but definitely, similar throughout. I think for me, I've definitely struggled a lot with kind of the tension of representing the US and very complicated feelings about doing so. And I think that's actually fueled some of my hesitancy to do so in kind of official capacities. And I think compared to my work as a girl advocate, where I wasn't, technically representing the US, other than, from being here. And even, for example, for the International Day of the Girl at the UN, our primary sponsors were, for example, Canada and Mexico, not the US in any form. And so I think that was honestly very freeing in terms of how much we could share. And definitely in other positions since then, I've always pushed for transparency as well, because I think that the only way that we're going to make any genuine progress on any of these issues is by like coming to the table with kind of things that we're all working on, and being transparent about that.
Tiffany?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting, the juxtaposition, because I'm often attached to an embassy, which means just by showing up, I'm representing the United States.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and I don't always think of myself as being an African American. I'm often just thinking of myself as an American. I also don't often actively think about the fact that I'm a woman. That's just kind of, it's a natural thing, like, eh. But what I've found is going to other countries, they're first of all surprised to see somebody show up that's not another white male. And second, they see in me somebody that can advocate for them. So I think the most striking example was, I went to Nepal, and I showed up to a women's event. So it was local women leadership, who had reached pretty high ranks in Kathmandu, and they were working with high school students, just trying to help them overcome some of the cultural limitations that they have. And it was really, it was serious issues such as domestic abuse and child marriage. And when I showed up, it was very much of a, oh, you can help. And on the one hand, they thought that I could, tell their story to, the president, which I obviously can't. But, it was also a recognition of, there's somebody here that looks like us, whether that be non-white or whether that be a woman. And simply by telling our story to you, we had more security that it's going to get out, that more people will know, that you will tell somebody. And that was just one example of many, that when I'm going out and just in other countries, they see advocacy when they see me. And at first it was completely took me aback. And now I just kind of, I've embraced it. And I've really gotten into sectors of social advocacy that I didn't expect.
Mm. I think that's so very interesting what you're just saying, is that how in an army or the military setting, you didn't think very much about yourself as a woman or as an African American. You have a job to do, you're going to do that. And then others perceive you in a way that actually open up the dimensions of your life. And I've often said that when people say, but who are you really? The question that, where you from, who are you really? I always say, depends. You want a short answer or the long answer? I have at least 6 identities, and it depends on the context. Sometimes I'm much more a woman of color. Sometimes I'm an Asian who happens to be American, but sometimes I'm American who just happens to be of Indian origin. And each one of these are very, very specific contexts. Sometimes I'm also a New Yorker who happens to come from Ahmedabad. And sometimes I'm an Ahmedabadi who happens to live in New York. And it's glib, but the point is that these are different dimensions of our lives. How to use it actively is a different kind of question than let people define you who you are, that you use it as an agency of where you're going. And that brings me to the question of, to some extent, and especially Tiffany, you have worked in many, many Asian settings, as have I, in the same way, much, much earlier than you. But the patriarchal culture of many cultures that you encounter, and Asha in the UN Women and girls, again, it's all kinds of people. And there are many cultures that actually are much more patriarchal than what we're used to here. How have you dealt with that idea of patriarchal culture and being a woman of color, representing sometimes America, sometimes not, sometimes you're in a global setting because you're just focusing on the issue? So give me an example of how you've dealt with that kind of an issue in a kind of more patriarchal setting that's much more traditional. In America, I mean, let's face it, we have plenty of patriarchy, but we actually still have also a lot more freedom than many, many other cultures. So Asha?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great question. And I think that, and definitely one that's come up a whole bunch in this kind of work. And I think that my approach has always been to be very critically mindful of the lens with which I'm coming in, which is, yes, all of those different identities and experiences, but also an American, someone was educated in America under our schools and our systems, and kind of the just inherently imperialist kind of eye that is coming with that, no matter how much we're working to do that within ourselves. And so I think as a part of all of that, I have always tried to push to defer to people in those communities now who are trying to make those changes. And are most familiar with the culture, as well as the issues, the patriarchal issues, the racist issues, whatever it may be, but are also actively working within the culture and within the communities to change them, to make sure that I and my work and our organizations are uplifting those voices that are doing that work, rather than kind of trying to speak for them, even, despite our lack of knowledge of the culture. And even with India, despite that obviously being a big part of my culture, I still don't live there. Like, I'm not that familiar with like the day-to-day intricacies and how it impacts girls and women there right now. And so that's still my go-to is just deferring to and uplifting those who are in the communities doing the work on the ground.
So partly what you're saying is that having a bifocal or multifocal vision in which, and I think that Tiffany, you talked about that in Nepal, that actually hearing others and how they see you, and then that informs who you are too. And therefore you create that multifocal vision, which to my mind is the advantage of being a woman of color in those settings, because you also recognize others who are in minority in their own setting. And describe for me a little bit what that's like, also to create empathy for other minorities in other places. And how do you bring that back to your work? Tiffany?
Yeah, kind of piggybacking on what Asha is saying, and what you're saying as well, like having different aspects of your identity that you can draw from. It's important to find the benefit in that, as opposed to what some people will try and create as a weakness, and using that to be able to identify with different cultures, and I've, especially in some overly patriarchal societies, I've had a hard time telling my taxi driver that he was passing my hotel, because he didn't want to believe that I knew that was my hotel. So there, it really is about, for me, it's about stepping back and recognizing the values of that culture and conversing on that level. So it's not that, my taxi driver had any opinion of me other than she, from his cultural lens, I did not have the knowledge that I knew that I have, right? So for me, it's about how can I step back and not place my judgment on it, and that's hard. As an American woman, I am fiercely independent, sometimes to my detriment, right? And so like it's for me, it's about how do I take that and put that to the side and relate from the same lens that they're looking at, because otherwise it doesn't matter what I'm saying, it won't come across effectively, or I can't get whatever it is that I need done. And yeah, I think it kind of like what you're saying. There are so many, there's just so much overarching cultural background, cultural history, cultural baggage. If you try to use that and hold that up, it's going to just be a hindrance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you're really saying is that how do you create empathy?
Mm-hmm.
So what I call the multifocal vision is also about having a big enough lens, and that allows you to look at somebody else not only as an opinion that you make of them, but try to understand them where they are. It's something that I have to say, in a current academic climate, is not in enough of a big supply. The idea of empathy for others to offer, and you making an effort to understand them, which requires suspending judgment, which is exactly what you were saying, and how to bring all of you into that arena. So I'll tell you both a very quick story. I'm much older than you are, so you'll appreciate this. But when I became the president of the Asia Society, Richard Holbrooke was a big, great statesman, larger than life figure in American Foreign Policy Establishment, was my chair. He decided that he was going to have in the press release that and press conference that how they chose Vishaka Desai, me, as the first president, female president, blah, 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 not because I was a woman, not because I was of an Asian origin, but because I was the best candidate. And so he was really trying to say it had nothing to do with gender, nothing to do with ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera. And it didn't sit well with me. So I told him afterwards in private, not in public. There was no point in getting somebody down like that. He was my boss after all. So I said, you know what? Don't ever say that again. Because I'm a woman, because I'm of Asian origin, I will be a different president. And hopefully even a better president, because I bring a lot of diversity to this job. And so I don't want you to negate who I am. I know you meant well. I mean, I had to say that. I know you meant well, but just don't say it again. And to my surprise, and he deferred and he didn't ever say that again. But it's that idea of using all of the tools at your disposal. And you, let's face it, as women of color, we have more tools at our disposal than a person who is only recognized as a white male. It's possible. However, I want to change the subject now and say that all sounds very good. You know, it all sounds like agency, it's all good. But I'm sure that both of you have had experience where it really came down as a real barrier. I want you to talk about what was that, a difficult moment, precisely because of who you are, and how did you handle it? And what was teachable of that moment as you go forward? Asha?
I was just thinking that I hope Tiffany goes first so I can think about it for a second. Tiffany, if you happen to have something in mind. Okay.
She's a little older, so she probably has more of that than you do, you know. That's maybe the generational difference. Yeah.
Well, generational and being in a very, very male-dominated career field, you know, and I've had, I have more than I can count, but you know, the most recent one is when you're in a position. So I was in a position where, you know, everybody has their own expertise. Not surprisingly, mine was speaking for China, Southeast Asia, and giving both analysis as well as, you know, policy recommendations, and how, you know, cultural recommendations on how to best implement whatever we want to do in certain countries. And, you know, it's one person deep. So I was the person, which means when people have questions, they come to me. But again, a very white male dominated office. And when I say something with authority and confidence and competence, it is met with, oh, I'm aggressive and I'm assertive. And whereas if somebody else were saying the exact same thing, it's like, oh, he has a good handle on the information.
Right, exactly. I'll be right back.
And it's a difficult position to be in. And, you know, I think the one thing, first of all, it in that particular instance, I had to learn how to change my approach and not speak with less confidence or competence, but also allow other people to speak so that everybody felt like they were having a say, which is not necessarily what anybody else in the office had to do. But sometimes it's recognizing that it's not about me, it's about getting this job done. And there's that. But then at the same time, it's learning how to effectively communicate with people so that you force them to look beyond the physical appearance and only hear what it is that you're saying, and also having the conversation. You know, like, hey, I got it, but do you think maybe, you know, finding the best time and the best place, and sometimes it's something that you have to do over beers and there's no other way to do it, but you know, it's, you think maybe you might have this opinion for this reason, and it's always difficult, and it's always uncomfortable, but I think it's extremely crucial to actually force people to think about the way that they are approaching things, because there's going to be somebody else that comes along after me, and they shouldn't have to experience the same.
Asha?
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Tiffany. Yeah, I think one instance that comes to mind, not relating to all of these pieces of identity and how they lead to perception and how we're treated, was one of my years as a girl advocate at the UN. Was we were doing, it was some kind of reception meeting type of thing with a lot of different UN policymakers, stakeholders. And there was a particular person from one of the big UN agencies who's very high up, very, you know, respected and very involved in specifically the girls' rights space, who was always, you know, reaching out to us, trying to collaborate and so on, who I was, you know, just in a conversation with. I think it was kind of, you know, a stand around mingle type thing. And so we were, you know, having a conversation about something substantive. I think this was during the period that the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, were being negotiated, and especially the indicators for them for measuring the outcomes relating to the SDGs. And we were kind of mid-conversation. Some other kind of bigwig came in the room, and he just like immediately, like, you know, his attention immediately shifted, and kind of, I barely finished my sentence and he, like, you know, moved over there, which, you know, I didn't like. It wasn't about the personal aspect of it. I didn't, you know, I wouldn't have taken it personally in that sense alone, but specifically, and it was specifically kind of a stark reminder of, you know, what people claim to support on paper versus what they actually claim to support in practice. And I think that that has analogies even to more recent, like, anti-racist movements in the US, and how, you know, it's great to post this or for a company to do this or that, but how is it actually impacting their day-to-day practices? And so, yeah, it was just almost funny to, funny in a dark way, obviously, but to see this person who is so involved in that space and so involved in girls advocacy to immediately, you know, turn away from two girl advocates to turn its attention to some, you know, supposedly fancy white man who just walked in. So, yeah.
Well, I think that in a way, what both of you are saying that I think is really interesting is that hierarchy will come up in many different ways, and that actions can speak as loudly, if not louder, than words. But that both of you did not take it personally, that you actually removed yourself from being victimized by that reaction. That's a really important thing that you both have. And it's crucial, because if you fight always from only the personal, then you actually won't be able to move the ball forward, because you're always saying, oh my God, what did he do to me? And at the same time, observe. It's a teachable moment, right? And I always feel like in all of these situations, the best thing is to recognize it's hardly ever about you personally. It is about their issue. But then what do you do about that? So Tiffany, you were saying over a beer at a bar. Sometimes I've often thought that I actually try to get my mentors or somebody I respect, including white men, to actually do that work on my behalf. At the same time, get them to recognize that this is an issue. It's not on, you know. And some of that may be generational. So I realized that my younger colleagues are going to say, yeah, that's a cop out. Why are you getting somebody else to say it? And I would say, well, I just do whatever I need to do. But essentially to just make sure message is conveyed and move on, and how best to do that. Because I think what's very interesting that Asha, you are the youngest among all of us, right? From what I can tell, because you're in graduate school and you still were in a class, that these things will happen. They will happen. Then how do you make a systemic change will depend on what do you do personally as you go forward. Of course, the onus shouldn't be just on you. Onus should be on those guys too. But it doesn't always happen like that. So that's kind of a given as you move forward. So as you see yourself, both of you, and where you are, what do you think, Tiffany, 10 years out, what do you think this field will be like, especially in the military, intelligence, state relationship with defense? Where do you think it will be for people of color, but also for women of color, particularly? And Asha, for you, you are in Yale Law School. You obviously want to work out the law and women's issues and legal issues. So I want you to both think about, what does the future hold as you see it from where the position you have? So Asha, you go first this time.
Yeah, I think that's a very complicated question based on if you're asking what I hope it looks like versus what I think it looks like, which the answer to which probably varies based on how optimistic or pessimistic I'm feeling on a particular day. But I do think that, we are largely speaking making steps in the right direction. And I think that centering intersectionality and focusing on those with the lived experience is really vital, both both from like the legal side of it in terms of models of lawyering and how we kind of center or don't center our clients and communities, and also in the global sphere and international affairs and advocacy on the global level and human rights level as well. I think that there are a ton of parallels there about how to kind of be mindful of the identities, the privileges, the marginalization that we're bringing into the space, as well as kind of making sure that we're keeping the focus where we intend for it to be in practice.
So I will ask you 10 years out and when I read about you. So that's it. Tiffany?
Yeah. There's two things that kind of come to mind. One is I worked for a senior foreign service officer who said, she was a female, and she said, when she came in to the State Department, if a woman became pregnant, it was just a known that that was the end of her career. Like, you could not be a mother and be in foreign service. And that's been within the last 20 to 30 years. And I think about that when I also think about the fact that especially in international relations, there tends to be a constant push and pull between the people who have been doing this for a very long time and looking at these same issues for a very long time, with fresh waves of people coming in and bringing new life into it. So while I would like to say there's going to be huge sweeping changes, the reality is there's always going to be that those institutionalized people influencing the field. But I think what will change is just as a country, we are becoming more and more aware of the need for different voices. And different doesn't just mean, African American or woman, or, it has a lot of, it can mean a lot of different things. And so that fresh wave is more and more diverse, so that what I hope in 10 years is that there are those fresh waves of people that are challenging the institutionalized thinking in ways that continue to push the envelope.
And I mean, it'll go through probably some tension too, because who wants to give up power? You know, that's a reality. So there's some push and pull, and then something becomes a norm that's new and different. So I think that one can only hope that diversity becomes a norm rather than an exception. Right there. It's a big hope, right? I know that we have some questions that are in our chat function. And Kayla, do you want to take us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thank you so much, Asha, Tiffany, for sharing your experiences. Again, I think we've been a lot better about having conversations about diversity in different fields, whether it's government, corporations, working in the public sector, private sector, but international affairs is, again, one of those fields that just slips through the cracks again, because there's this veneer of, again, diverse space, people of different backgrounds. So just hearing your specific anecdotes, Tiffany, just, listening to your experience, having the burden being on you to change your behavior in the space that you work in, even though you've spent your entire academic career building up expertise, is just something that really, I'm sure resonates with so many women of color working in this space. And I guess that we have a question in the Q&A box, but if anyone else has any in the audience, but I think we're running up on time, but please feel free to drop in the chat. So I guess I'll open up the Q&A section by asking, as an Asian American who spent my entire academic career focused on Middle Eastern studies and then beginning to start my career as a young professional, I've found it extremely disheartening because, again, Tiffany, I know you were saying you spent your entire life being a China specialist only for people to question you. I guess for me, like someone with a bicultural identity, there's always this assumption that if I'm entering a space, it's to become an Asia specialist or China specialist, because that's the cultural background that I grew up in, even though, I'm trying to learn Arabic, I'm learning Turkish and all these things, but it doesn't matter because that's just how people perceive me. And I'm sure both of you know, international affairs is this huge career, a huge field where you're spending most of your career defining your expertise. What is your niche? And I guess I was wondering if you guys could speak more to this idea of, how being of different cultural identities, having different identities has shaped your agency in the field and your ability to define your interests, because I feel like so much of it, when you're a young woman of color in this field, so much of it is just about entering the field. You take the opportunities that you can get and you have so much less agency about in terms of being able to define your own interests and shaping the trajectory of your own career. Maybe we could start with Tiffany and then go to Asha.
Yeah, sure. And I'll try to be quick for time. I completely understand what you're saying. Try being the only African-American in the room who then starts speaking Chinese better than most of your colleagues. I think that in and of itself, I have tried to cultivate a mindset that I am here and I belong here. And even when people try to think otherwise, project otherwise, they can't change the fact that I am here for a reason. And there's a way to do that without being arrogant, right? To have the confidence without having the arrogance, so that, when you speak, people listen. And it doesn't matter what your field is. And it actually helps when you're somebody who they're not expecting to hear it from, because then, they're kind of taken aback, and in that, pause of a shock, of a gasp, that's when you get your words in. And it doesn't matter how do you get your words in as long as you start talking.
Yeah, I think that as someone who also studied Middle Eastern studies in undergrad, that's definitely super real. And I think people, like, the next question is just if, one of my parents is from the Middle East or something, and they're not, they're both from India. But I mean,
and India is not Middle East. Let's get that straight, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like it's interesting because there is a slight personal tie in the sense that so my mom is Hindu and my dad is Muslim, even though they're both from India. And so I think my initial, like the spark for interest in learning Arabic came partly from the Muslim ancestry side, but then obviously developed into a much deeper interest in the region. And so, yeah, I think that that is definitely something that comes up and is really interesting to try to navigate without kind of putting myself in. I think especially now that I'm in law school and in kind of the legal field, I think something that I've been really trying to balance is balancing kind of my background in girls' rights, Middle Eastern studies, those different more global focused aspects with the domestic work that I want to be doing, at least immediately within trial work in the US, and kind of fighting to make sure that like it doesn't have to be one side that wins out over the other. They're not, you know, an opposite, and can both still exist within me and my interests and what, you know, the kind of person, professional, whatever I'm seen as. So yeah.
And I think that this question, Kayla, is particularly relevant more for Asian Americans than for many other groups, in my experience. I mean, I have stories after stories of a Japanese colleague of mine who wanted to study Italian Renaissance art, comes from Japan to go to graduate school for that, and people steer her into Japanese art. And she said, but I don't want to study that. And they said, but you have the language, why don't you just do it? And I've often felt that I wish I did Italian Baroque rather than Indian art history, because I just wish I had really broken out of that, you know, because it was typical of just how people do that. So I think to some extent, though, as Tiffany's describing, that know your subject, speak with calm authority, and be clear, not let others define you. It's the way you want to define yourself. Hard to do, but just keep at it. Very important.
Absolutely. I think we're about out of time, so I'm just going to ask the one last question from the Q&A box. So what is it like returning? This is from Gwen, who's actually on our core committee. So thank you, Gwen, for asking a question. What is it like returning to the US after advocating and learning abroad? How has it changed the way or shaped the way that you perceive institutions, family, friends, back when you've returned to the US? And how has the adjustment been? And maybe we could start with Asha this time and then go to Tiffany.
Yeah, I think thinking in terms of my work with UN Women that just wrapped up, but over the past 2 years. So that's an example of where there was supposed to be a lot more abroad in person that, you know, didn't happen due to everything. But I think even minus the physically coming back to the US aspect of it, still the kind of like bringing the work that I'm doing in that very global cohort back to like American institutions, I think is still pretty analogous. And I think that there's often a lot of, I think there are kind of different ideas and pictures of professionalism, for example, that equates to what is taken seriously and what isn't. And so I think that that's been one thing that has been difficult to navigate in a way where I'm presenting my colleagues' work with as much respect and, you know, genuineness as it deserves, while also kind of ensuring that it's seen and taken seriously by the people I'm presenting it to, and not kind of modifying their work to kind of fit the molds of American views of professionalism, while still, again, pursuing the goal effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. Tiffany?
Yeah, so I'm usually taken aback by how intimately familiar other countries are with what's going on in America. Um, that I get asked all kinds of questions about, you know, what's been said and what's been done, and I have to go back and Google it myself. And then I come back to the US and I always get frustrated by how little we pay attention to what's going on in the eaches of other countries. Um, and so that's always something that I try to, you know, just remind people, hey, oh, by the way, look what's going on in, you know, country X. Pay attention to the greater world around you because it matters. And what happens in one country can intimately affect what happens in another. You know, pandemic aside, you know, what's going on in Ukraine, we will almost definitely see food shortages in a year, you know? So it really is important to just pay attention.
On that note, we have come to the end of this conversation. But before I let you go, I'm going to ask each one of you one quick question and see if you can answer it in one sentence. Most of the people who are on this call are students, undergraduate students. If you had to advise them of what their next step ought to be, one sentence, what would you say? Tiffany?
I would probably say don't be constrained by other people's restraints.
Terrific. Asha?
Yeah, I would say to give yourself grace, and also to kind of fight to keep believing in yourself and what you know about yourself.
Absolutely. And remember, it's okay to be fallible, but not okay to dream big. It's okay. So with that, let me just say what a thrill it is to talk with both of you. Thank you, Kayla, for actually thinking this up. And thanks UCGT. Continue to be involved. As Tiffany reminds us, knowing about the world is everybody's business, no matter where you are. So thank you for joining us. Thank all of you, the audience, for joining us as well, and have a good evening. Okay. Hey guys, fabulous. It's wonderful.